Sorry, guys, got a phone call right there. Okay, so previously, more boys were playing sports than girls, and largely because the funding went to the boys' sports. So, what the Title IX amendments really do is they help create a Title IX generation of women's athletes. And then we see lots of opportunities for girls and women to come in, girls and women to come in and play sports. This creates the Title IX generation that starts to help professionalize sports in the 80s and 90s. You know, some of our best World Cup teams, for instance, that helped kind of popularize sports in the United States. The Mia Hamms of the world, et cetera, coming out of this Title IX generation. So that's a big victory, obviously, for the feminist movement. But a big disappointment was the Equal Rights Amendment. And the Equal Rights Amendment was proposed in the 1920s as well. And it's just very simple. It's an amendment to the Constitution that would declare equality of rights under the law that shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or any state on the account of sex. Very simply, that means it is illegal to sexually discriminate. It's illegal to discriminate with someone because of their sex. Now, that is not written in the Constitution. It is inferred in the Constitution with the 14th Amendment that says that you cannot discriminate to any citizen, but it doesn't specifically mention sex. And so because of this, this is something that it seems like it would be common sense. Let's put this in the Constitution. Why not? Congress is going to write up this law. They are going to pass this law. It goes through both houses of Congress. But if you're amending the Constitution, it's not like any law. When you change the Constitution, it has to be ratified by the states. In fact, it has to be ratified by 3/4 of the states, and that means it needs to be ratified by 38 states. So why not? Why wouldn't that be ratified? Of course it would be, except that for some reason, in both times that the Equal Rights Amendment was proposed, but especially in this time, we see a really strong conservative backlash. We actually see people come in and fight this being implemented into the Constitution, and those people would be called anti-feminists. They're going to come in and resist this that simply says that there should not be discrimination based on sex. In this particular case, the anti-feminist movement is led by a woman by the name of Phyllis Schlafly, and she's actually going to fight against this. She's going to say that this is women that are trying to find a constitutional problem for their personal problems. That's her own quote. She's then going to talk about this would be infringing upon, and this is another quote, or I'll paraphrase, this would be infringing upon the women's right to be supported by her husband. She's also going to blame this sort of thing on rising divorce rates. And she's going to say, because there's so much call for equality, that you are taking away the traditional rights of women. And you're saying that this is causing the sanctity of marriage to be infringed upon. We're also going to have groups like the Catholic Church that are going to say, because the feminist movement was so tied to the right to choose on the abortion debate, that the Catholic Church opposed the ERA. The sad truth of this is that the ERA dies in 1982, and it's only 3 states short of success. And it's because of women like this, Phyllis Schlafly, that actually went around from state to state and campaigned against the ERA. She had something called the Stop ERA movement. In fact, I think there's actually a movie coming out on this. I'm going to check into that and see if we can do a little, well, I guess we can't go to the movie theaters. I was going to say we could go watch a movie on that for extra credit, but we can't even go to the movies. Okay, we've got some landmark cases. We are almost done. We have some landmark cases. Okay, so Bakke v. California is the first one. So we have Alan Bakke, who's a Californian, and he's a white guy, and he's looking to get into UC Davis. I believe it's the medical school. And he applies 2 years in a row, and both years he's rejected. And he's got some decent credentials, he's got some decent grades. And so he is going to sue UC Davis and the state of California because he didn't get into medical school. He's going to say that it's an unfair system where admissions are skewed to admit minorities that perhaps have lower credentials. This is a pretty big case because it's going to grab the attention of all Americans and looking at, well, what is the situation here? Is this, in fact, reverse discrimination? What is the policy with this? The Supreme Court is divided on this. Supreme Court doesn't know what to do on this. It's a 5-4 decision, so it's a heavily split decision. And what the Supreme Court says is even kind of skewed in its actual ruling. It says that preference in administrations cannot be given to any group because of ethnic or racial identity alone. So that's big. I mean, that pokes a big hole in affirmative action there, because it says, okay, you can't just give preference because of race or ethnicity, right? But then it adds, but you could use racial factors and take it into account to assemble a diverse student body. So this weakens affirmative action. What it's essentially saying is it cannot be the sole reason in admitting students or admitting people into a business, but you can use racial factors as a factor. Now, what that means is going to have to be interpreted by the states in years to come. United States v. Wheeler, this has to do with Native Americans. This is actually on the context of a Native American group that went in and actually captured the island of Alcatraz, once a federal prison, and actually kept it as essentially occupied for over a year to bring about attention to their cause, which was how there had not been extended rights to Native Americans. And United States v. Wheeler does extend more rights to Native Americans and says Native Americans are outside the purview of the states, and they only need to listen to orders of Congress. They don't need to listen to the orders of the states. That's why we see the federal Indian preserves protected by the federal government. Okay, almost there. So 1976, we have a presidential election, and we have Gerald Ford running for the Republicans, but he was doomed from the get-go because he pardoned Nixon. Then we have a Democratic candidate, James Earl Carter. And Carter, guys, is a fascinating dark horse candidate. He's literally a peanut farmer from Georgia. He's a peanut farmer from Georgia, and he's going to run, and he's going to say, I've never held office. He basically was talking about, I'm not going to lie to you. I'm not going to come in and be a politician. My job is to come in and try and bring your faith back in the American government. And he is going to just do enough to win a very, very tight race between Ford and Carter. And he is going to become our next American president in 1976. Now, look, Carter is a tough one, guys. Carter is such a good person. I mean, no one really debates that the guy just had a great moral compass. He wanted what was best for the American people. He just lived in a really, really tough time. He had some factors that were really out of his control, the Tehran hostage crisis being one of them, and then the continuing oil crisis. And it's funny because originally, as he comes into the presidency, one of the things that he talks about is renewable energy. He talks about having running cars on electricity, those sort of things. And he's laughed at, he's scoffed at the time. Americans, don't take him seriously. And this guy was probably 50 years before his time. I mean, this guy knew what he was talking about, but he just was the wrong man for the wrong time because he's going to be hit with some really tough situations. Now, one of the things that he's best known for in a positive light is what we call as humanitarian diplomacy up at the top, humanitarian diplomacy. He had a big concern for human rights around the world. He's going to protect human rights in Rhodesia, now Zimbabwe, in South Africa. He's also going to fight to try and get some peace in the Middle East, particularly between Egypt and Israel. And that is especially encapsulated by the Camp David Accords. Camp David Accords were in 1978. Camp David, of course, we've talked about it once before, but I'll remind you, is the Woodlands Retreat in Maryland. The president often will take foreign leaders to Camp David to try and negotiate terms, negotiate deals, those sort of things. Carter is going to invite the president Sadat of Egypt and Prime Minister Begin of Israel. And they're going to bring them together at Camp David. And they've had all this violence. In fact, in 73, there was more violence. There was a major invasion of Egypt and then of Israel. And there needs to be changes. There needs to be peace in the Middle East. And what we see is both sides, after about 13 days, are going to come to sign a formal peace treaty that says within 3 months, we will recognize each other as not enemies of each state. In fact, this is the first time that Egypt recognizes Israel and Israel recognizes Palestine. We see some positive steps in the right direction here. This is perhaps Carter's most crowning achievement, was the Camp David Accords. Sadly, this doesn't last. And had we had cooler heads like President Carter, perhaps it may have lasted. It doesn't, but it is marked as one of the great periods of detente between Egypt and Israel. We also see full diplomatic relations with China, resuming full diplomatic relations with China, started by Nixon, now increasing with Carter. Carter also pledges to return the Panama Canal to Panama, which is still being operated by the United States. Will return Panama Canal to Panama by the year 2000. But Carter faces some major economic problems. One of which is inflation. Inflation is just stubbornly creeping. Inflation's up 13% by 1979, and the biggest reason why is oil. OPEC quadrupled its prices after the oil crisis of 73. The U.S. is going into debt, and we're having some huge deficits, guys. Talking about $60 billion annually in deficits. And quite frankly, the U.S. economy just isn't dominating like it did throughout the first half of the 20th century. All the way into 1970, things were going well, and then we see that oil prices essentially are causing massive inflation. And now banks, because we have inflation, banks now are going to raise their interest rates. And the thought process on that is when you borrow money from the bank, you have to pay that money back. But as inflation continues, you're paying back that bank with depreciated dollars, with inflated dollars. And so if they raise the interest rate, that protects the bank because it says, okay, now you have to pay more money in order to borrow money from the bank, and therefore that they can continue to make a profit. But the problem is there's places like small businesses or the construction industry that depend heavily on banks and can really depend heavily on loans and making sure that they can borrow money to have these big construction projects. And unfortunately, by raising the interest rates, that's going to cause small businesses to collapse, and construction industry is going to suffer. And we've got some big economic problems in the 1970s. There's no doubt about that. And Carter correctly diagnoses the problem as dependence on foreign oil. He says if we can get dependent on all of this oil that's flowing in from the Middle East, that's going to cure our inflation problems. That's going to cure our deficits. And he calls to the American people to try and find solutions to this, to try and find ways in which we can use renewable energy, all these sort of things. And yet he's met with indifference by the American people. American people are not willing to change their lifestyle. And it's sad because, again, Carter was so ahead of his times in this. And then things really get bad, and it's going to get bad because of Iran. Shah Mohammad Reza Pahlavi was our dictator, our pro-American dictator that was instilled by the CIA during the Eisenhower administration. You might remember that Eisenhower used a covert operation by the CIA to secure American oil interests. And now Pahlavi has been diagnosed with cancer. He's been diagnosed with cancer, and he needs help from the American people by the best medical professionals in the world at this stage in the United States. And so he is going to need treatment, and he's going to leave the country, and the whole Pahlavi regime is going to collapse. And so we see shortages of oil that's going to fall off of this because the new regime, which is a Muslim fundamentalist regime, is going to start to nationalize their oil and control their own oil. That's a big problem because now the United States has lost its major artery of oil out of Iran. Now that there's oil shortages once again, OPEC now sees an opportunity to raise oil prices because now they once again have a strong monopoly on oil. Now oil's once again are oil pinched. We have continuous lines at the gas station, all these sort of things. This is a crisis. What is Carter going to do about this? Carter does an interesting thing. He retreats by himself to Camp David for 10 days. He's just there, not with, outside of the media's eye. And he says, I need to think about this. I need to ponder this. And he actually meets with foreign leaders and different peoples of all types. He meets with business leaders. He meets with different religious leaders. And he's trying to come up with a solution to this. And when he finally comes out of his self-imposed isolation, he gives this speech to the American people where he says that our problem is self-imposed and that we have too much value in materialistic goods. What he essentially does is he criticizes the American people for being too materialistic. He says we need to stop spending so much and stop using so much, and that will solve our problem. And while he may have been right, the American people did not want to be criticized in this moment. They looked for their leader to go in and secure oil and not to come in and criticize them for using too much oil. And Carter loses a lot of momentum here with this speech, and it looks like he may have lost touch with the mood of the country. And then things only get worse in Iran, because then anti-American Muslim militants are going to storm the U.S. embassy in Tehran. And the context for this is they're mad that the United States is allowing Pahlavi, the dictator of Iran, to be harbored in the United States. That these militant Muslim, I guess I wouldn't call them terrorists. I would just say these Muslim militant groups that have stormed this embassy in a very terrorist-like fashion are coming in to hold the United States accountable for harboring Shah Pahlavi, who, I mean, to be fair to them, Pahlavi was an American instilled dictator that was obviously causing a tremendous amount of problems. And so, what happens here? This is our Tehran hostage crisis. We see all occupants of the embassy in Tehran are held hostage. And they demand that the U.S. ship the Shah back to Iran. The United States policy is that they don't negotiate with terrorists. So what is our situation here? We see a 444-day hostage crisis in which there is not any good solution to this. We don't know really how to solve this problem. And then the Soviets invade Afghanistan. And when the Soviets invade Afghanistan, this is a big moment, guys, because this looks like the Soviets are making a grab for the world oil, that they are looking to seize the oil of the Middle East and not allow the United States to have access to oil. Now, this movement into Afghanistan probably was for that exact purpose by the Soviets, to seize world oil. And this scares the American people, and it's going to demand action by the American people. But ironically, this invasion into Afghanistan, guys, is really what we would look at for the Soviets as their Vietnam. Vietnam for the United States meant years and years of manpower and money being spent in a war that was essentially unwinnable. And for the Soviets, that's what Afghanistan is. Afghanistan is a money pit for the Soviets, and the same sort of warfare, guerrilla warfare, being used against the Soviets. The Soviets never do win that war in Afghanistan, but at the time it scares the American people into thinking that their oil lifeline has been completely taken away. And so because of this, what is Carter going to do? He's going to place an embargo on all of the export of grain and technology to the Soviet Union. He's also going to call for a boycott of the Olympic Games that were to be held in Moscow later that year. He is going to prepare the U.S. for war in case this happens, requesting men and women to register for a possible draft. But as the days go by and nothing happens, Carter is going to then decide to order a quite drastic rescue attempt. Operation Eagle Claw is what it's called. And Carter orders a helicopter rescue attempt. Unfortunately, there was a technology breakdown, an equipment failure, and two helicopters actually run into each other, and it creates a disaster. 8 Americans are killed in this. The hostages are not rescued, and Carter really, at that point, has no chance at re-election. This hostage crisis is going to drone on until Reagan's presidency. When Reagan is elected president, the hostage crisis is over. But lots of material, guys. We are finally done with the notes. Look, the best way to study for this, guys, is, you can watch this lecture, obviously, but do your HPG. I did make a very sizable HPG for you guys. Your test is going to be on Wednesday. I will send some more reminds on that. But, read pageant, do your HPG, and you're going to do great. And you can send me a remind with any questions or concerns. You got this, APUSH. We got this. Let's do this and be safe.